John, it is without further ado that thank you so much for being here, really. We've been talking a bunch this week, but it's just really great to have you here with us and doing this great presentation for us. Everybody keep up the chats, let us have any questions, and John, I'm gonna just give it up to you right now. I'm gonna mute myself and you are good to go.
Thank you, Helen. That was a pretty amazing introduction. You basically met my entire bibliography and personal biography there. Hi, I'm John Martini. I'm from San Francisco, like Helen said, and I was lucky enough to have a 25-year career with the National Park Service. Much of it was like here in my own backyard in San Francisco. Alcatraz was my first duty station as a park ranger. I grew up as a kid in the Bay Area. I'm old enough that I've got real strong memories of when the island was still a penitentiary. And you'd see it on Bay Cruise boats as you went around it. And I distinctly remember the day that it closed and events that took place afterwards, the Native American occupation from 1969 to 1971. I was in college. I remember hearing that it was going to be open to the public and that it was going to become a national park site. And all of a sudden, I was offered a seasonal position on Alcatraz. And shortly after the island was open to the public for the first time in October 1973, I started as a young park ranger. I became fascinated with the island because, well, let's jump into it. Yes, if you say Alcatraz, this is what people think of. They envision the big cell house, the big house, tiers upon tiers of cells like some sort of horrific aviary. All the Hollywood movies, all the potboiler novels, this is the image of Alcatraz. I like to tell people, you can go just about any place in the world, and if there's a DVD player or cable network to a television, you say Alcatraz, people go Clint Eastwood, or they go Birdman of Alcatraz. The image is so pervasive, and part of that is the result of a real premise that the Bureau of Prisons ran with starting in the 1930s, which was to make this sort of a celebrity prison. Not that celebrities were held there, but that the most notorious convicts in the federal prison system would be held there incommunicado, but in plain view, to be made examples of. But the island has a lot of history. The famous penitentiary, it was actually remarkably short-lived. It was 29 years, from 1934 to 1963. I realize now that, boy, my experience with Alcatraz goes back 46 years, much longer than it was ever a penitentiary. So where does Alcatraz history start? Let's pull up one of the earliest maps I've seen of San Francisco Bay that shows the location of the various islands in the bay. It's a 1779 Spanish map. And the Spanish were not notoriously great map makers out here in California. So I'll use an arrow here to show you that down there at lower right in shorthand, Spanish, Y stands for Isla. Isla Alcatrazes, Island of the Pelicans. The name of Alcatraz, the actual translation of Alcatraz, we usually refer to calling it Island of Pelicans, although ancient Spanish translations seem to say that the word Alcatraz referred to any big winged bird. Think of like albatross, Alcatraz, kind of similar. And hey, those were the only people living on the island when the only living things on Alcatraz when the Spanish explored San Francisco Bay in the 1770s. We have no idea what Native Americans must have made of Alcatraz. There's nothing that really comes down to us except secondhand stories that it was sort of a place of bad juju, something to be avoided, which makes sense because it was just a big barren rock with nothing on it and no habitation. A couple of years later in the 1820s, British made a better map of the harbor, and keep looking at the arrow. All of a sudden, Alcatraz is called Yerba Buena Island. What happened? Well, the British mapmaker, Frederick Beechey, who made this for the British Admiralty, he juggled some of the location names on the bay. And if you watch for the next arrow, there's Alcatrazes. It got moved. It got moved to what was previously just a barren rock, something like, shall we say, seal rocks in the middle of San Francisco Bay. It's been Alcatraz ever since. It's a map maker's error. Earliest photo we found of the island is this one, taken either in 1852 or 1853 from Nob Hill. It's a daguerreotype. And you're looking over the ridge of Russian Hill towards the original Alcatraz. I like that someone described this island photograph as it looks like a whale sort of, basking in San Francisco Bay. But it fits the description that all the early explorers had of Alcatraz. 22 acres, rock, seasonal grasses that somehow grew up in the crust of bird guano that coated the island, no fresh water, no good for anything, except it was in the middle of San Francisco Bay. And the old expression, location, 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 is going to kick in here, because sitting in the middle of the bay, it was really like a cork that bottled up San Francisco Bay. And it was also something of a hazard to navigation that ships could run into if they didn't know what was happening. I won't go through my whole other show on the evolution of San Francisco, but suffice it to say, Spain colonized San Francisco. He lost control of California to Mexico. Mexico lost control of California to the United States. One civilian, late in the Mexican era, did get a land grant to Alcatraz, but he never did anything with it. His name was Julian Workman, a Yankee living in Mexican California. His land grant specified he was supposed to build a lighthouse on the island. He never did. The U.S. government just claimed the island, along with most of California, as U.S. government land. Title would be, sussed out later. All this is going to change. In 1848, in January, when gold's discovered in California, San Francisco explodes from many numbers have been quoted, but I preferred that when the gold was discovered, approximately 850 people lived in San Francisco. By the time this picture was taken, in 1853, the number was probably closer to 50,000. The biggest growth, 35,000 people, arrived between 1848 and 1851. And what did San Francisco become? The biggest metropolis on the West Coast, essentially the only one on the West Coast, a port, and pretty soon, what comes along with a port, with a booming economy, you have shipyards, and you have manufacturing. And with the gold that was coming out of the Sierra Nevadas, pretty soon a mint was established here, and shipyards, and a military arsenal. And San Francisco was the prime target for possible foreign intervention on the West Coast. Who were we afraid of? Well, basically, Big Bad Britain. They had the world's biggest navy. They had a major port up in Vancouver Island. And they also had a claim to California, going back to Sir Francis Drake. The United States decided they needed to fortify and protect San Francisco Bay. Alcatraz, location, location, location. It was chosen as a site for a fort and maybe for us, more importantly, a lighthouse. The first lighthouse on the West Coast was built on Alcatraz, went into service in 1854. Again, that Alcatraz is a cork in the bay. Well, ships could easily run into it, so a light on Alcatraz warned ships away from the rocky shores of the island. Plus, it served as a beacon. If you were outside the Golden Gate trying to sail in, especially at night, if you could see the beam on Alcatraz, it meant you weren't going to run into the Marin Headlands or the Presidio of San Francisco. It guided you in. Simultaneously, throughout the 1850s, the Army fortified Alcatraz. They carved out clefts, niches surrounding the entire island, and they installed the biggest cannon in the military arsenal. And Alcatraz became famous through the 1850s as a mysterious harbor fort in the center of San Francisco Bay. This is the west side looking towards the Marin Headlands. Cannon here faced right at the Golden Gate. So any ship coming in, if it made it past the Fort Point at the Presidio, it had to go right towards Alcatraz Island. And there were only two courses, either go straight at the island and then around to the south towards Telegraph Hill, or go around to the north. On the north side of the island, that's Belvedere Island in the distance, cannon everywhere. At the height of the Civil War, there were something around 400, 450 soldiers on Alcatraz waiting for an enemy that never came. We did not know that the Confederacy might not make an armed attack on San Francisco during the American Civil War. We weren't sure that the British, who were openly on the side of the Confederates, might not make an attack on San Francisco. So when these pictures were taken in early 1864, the cannon, they are loaded, they are armed, they are ready, and again, waiting for possible combat. From San Francisco's point of view, looking out into the bay, Alcatraz looks something like a European hill city. If you've ever been to Spain or Italy, the old tradition of take a hilltop and build a fort on top of it, and you cluster your houses in the shadow of the walls of the castle at the top, and then you surround the base of the hill with walls, and that was Alcatraz. It sometimes was called Fortress Alcatraz. And when this picture was taken, that large building at the top of the island, it was a three-story brick barracks building where the soldiers and the offices and the hospital were all located. It was the most permanent building on the island, also something of a target, as you can tell even from this distance. It rose high. What helped Alcatraz was it was well over a mile from the mainland, which was outside the range of most cannon shot. The little lighthouse to the right, the little whitish building, the smaller whitewashed buildings along the hills, those were barracks buildings for soldiers, laundresses, quarters, warehouses. The island had enough water and supplies to hold out for about 5 months in case of siege. Why 5 months? That's about how long it would take for a relief column to come to California from the East Coast. The island was just immensely armed. The biggest cannon that were manufactured during the Civil War, 5 of these gigantic guns were cumbersomely loaded aboard sailing ships sent around Cape Horn, offloaded and brought to the island. They fired a 440-pound cannonball nearly 3 miles that could take out any ship that was in existence. This is how seriously the Army took Alcatraz in its defensive role. But people lived on the island. I mentioned there were over 450 soldiers. The officers who lived on the island, they brought their families with them. And this is a little embryonic garden on Alcatraz located in the shadow of the building called the Citadel. Women, if you look carefully, there's a couple of kids here. It took me a long time looking at this photograph to realize everybody's got their eyes shut because the exposure probably took 2 or 3 seconds, and it was a rare, bright, sunny day on Alcatraz. The island, though, it was closed to the public. You had to have business to go out to Alcatraz, and it became a place, if you will, of mystery. Because the public couldn't get out there, because it had these mysterious cannon on it of immense size, and also because of its shadowed, rumored history of being used as a prison. It all led to a fascination with the mysterious island. When this picture was done in the 1870s for one of the illustrated newspapers on the East Coast, they made it look a little bit more, let's say, bedraggled than it really was. It actually was a magnificently maintained island because they had a lot of free labor out there, soldiers. But because it was distant and it was kind of abysmal and people always wrote that the wind blew constantly, it pretty soon picked up a nickname of being the Rock. I found it as early as 1881 in newspaper articles, and the name stuck. Prisoners on Alcatraz. During the American Civil War, the United States government decided that Alcatraz was a great place to start locking up suspected Confederate sympathizers or Confederate spies or people who actively took up arms against the United States. And there were some in San Francisco, full-on traitors aligned with the Confederacy. Well, they were locked up on Alcatraz, and this is what you had your prisoners do out there. You know, break rocks, turn big ones into little ones was the joke. So starting in the 1860s, you had a mix of who were essentially prisoners of war or seditious people, and the island was called a political prison numerous times in official documents, kind of chilling statement. But there were also dozens and dozens of U.S. Army soldiers who, you know, they may have been loyal to the U.S. Army, but they had also broken military law. They were military prisoners, going AWOL, fighting, drunk and disorderly. These were disgraced U.S. Army soldiers who were undergoing punishment. So Alcatraz, it's got a dual role. It's a defense fort, and it's also loaded with prisoners. These prisoners here, if you look closely at your computer monitor, you can see there's dozens of them on that hillside with picks and shovels. What are they doing? They're cutting that huge hill down, and people are trundling rock. They're dumping it over the walls. That's how the island got its present shape. Picture taken about 1865 of Alcatraz from San Francisco. The Army learned during the Civil War that the island and its citadel on top were so big that they probably would have been a very large target, especially as long-range artillery was developed during the Civil War. And about 1870, they came up with an idea: well, we're going to cut Alcatraz down. We're going to shave it off, as it'll be two-tiered. And hard as it is to believe, they almost did it. This photograph, taken from about the same perspective a few years later, shows the south end of the island plateaued off. They cut away 70 foot of solid rock. What did they do with the rock? They threw it over the side. The island is actually slightly larger than it was when it was discovered because of continual cutting and dumping of rock over the side. Where did the prisoners live? There was no big prison building like we see today. There was a scattering of these ramshackle wood and brick cell blocks, mostly on the side of the island near where the dock is today. They're gone without a trace, but photographs reveal what was called the lower prison. Those are wooden cell blocks. If you were to go inside them, you had tier after tier of wood cells. They were built of heavy planks. What you did was you took one layer of planks, like you see here, running horizontally, and then there'd be an interior layer of planks running vertically, so the grain was going in a different direction. The doors were strap iron. The cells inside, they were only 3 feet by 6 feet in size, about the size of a closet. They didn't hold more than a cot and what they called a night vessel, because there was no plumbing. And I can't stress this enough, as the soldiers that were sent to Alcatraz as prisoners, one historian said they were the dregs of the United States Army. These were people that probably enlisted in the military in the 1870s and 80s and 90s, maybe as a last resort. Maybe they were running from the law. Maybe they were uneducated, had no other options, and Uncle Sam offered what was called 3 squares and a cot. Just because you're a soldier in the U.S. Army doesn't necessarily mean that you live up to the moral standards of the Army. And you look at the records, why were these guys being sent to the island? Basically, they broke military law. They were given long sentences for things like especially desertion and fighting and theft of government property, and sometimes really dark stuff, manslaughter, rape. In this picture taken in 1903, you can see the soldiers on the left. They have P written on their hats and on the back of their clothes. These people were frequently taken to San Francisco under armed guard to do work details, like at the Presidio in Fort Mason. If you try to hightail it, the big P on your hat and the back of your jacket's going to give you away. Where did they come from? Alcatraz was officially designated the United States Army's military prison for the West. And that meant everything west of the Rockies. And as the United States grew and expanded in its colonialism era after 1898, you had guys coming from as far as Alaska, Guam, the Philippine Islands, and the island just grew and grew and grew until it was no longer a fort. It no longer defended San Francisco Bay. It didn't have any really defensive role. It was a prison. And in addition to U.S. Army soldiers, prisoners of war, prisoners of Indian wars, they were sent to Alcatraz. Apache warriors, Modoc Indians from the Modoc Wars. And this is probably the most unique group and the largest group that came to Alcatraz. These are actually some of the most peaceful folks, Hopi, 19 of them. Why were they sent to Alcatraz? They were sent to the island because they had refused to go along with the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the U.S. Army's policy of sedentary, or rather stationary, agriculture instead of being nomadic. Plus, they had to go along with policy of sending their children to Indian schools run by the Indian Affairs, where they would become Americanized, cut their hair, and learn English and be exposed accidentally to various forms of measles and mumps and white man's diseases. These 19 guys, they were all fathers of children who wouldn't go along with the program. They refused to send their kids to the Indian schools. And as a result, they were taken away from their tribes and they were sent to Alcatraz. They weren't there for severe punishment. Newspapers were full of stories about the 19 Hopi fathers, as they were called. Their chief in the center there wearing a sash blanket, and he's wearing a U.S. Army officer's hat. Limahongiama. These guys were kind of odd celebrities in San Francisco. They were constantly being ferried over the city. They were taken to the opera. They were taken to white man schools all over San Francisco, obviously trying to show them, hey, look, it's not that bad. They had lunch with Adolf Sutro, who was mayor of San Francisco, at his house. Got a private tour of Sutro baths. And on the island, when they weren't being taken to the city, they did something. They sawed logs. They hauled rocks around. None of them were confined in dark solitary or anything. The Army really didn't know what to do with these folks. When they showed up, they were still dressed like for the Southwest, in barefoot and with loincloths and simple wraps around their shoulders. So the U.S. Army issued them Army enlisted man's uniforms. Except for Loma Hongiama. He was allowed, as I said, to keep his chief's robe. The Army wasn't trying to break these guys' spirits. They were basically trying to co-opt them. The island was a pleasant place to be stationed in the Army at that time, except for the wind that everybody still complains about even today. The peacetime island in the 1880s and 1890s started looking like something like a little Victorian village. This was donated by the descendant of the young woman seated on the ground at lower right. She was a young woman living on the island. Her father is standing directly behind her, him of the fierce mustache, not looking too happy. Maybe it's because the guy at the extreme right is a young lieutenant from the Presidio who was courting his daughter. They later got married. And those are the more senior officers on the left. Very rare for us military historians. They're wearing those German Army influenced pickelhaube helmets that were around in the 1880s and 1890s. At the turn of the century, when the island was more and more becoming a prison, they made a decision in Washington, D.C. They were going to do one of three things with Alcatraz. It wasn't a fort. So they were either going to move the prisoners off and rebuild it as a modern fort, or they were going to give the island to the state of California and just abandon Alcatraz entirely, or three, they were going to turn it into a state-of-the-art prison. They went with Plan 3. And from 1908 to 1912, Army prisoners on the island constructed the world's largest concrete cell house. Steel work going up, the old lighthouse in the background. And when it was finished in 1912, it was like nothing else in the U.S. Army prison system. I'll say this for the Army Quartermaster Department that designed and built the prison. They went with state-of-the-art modern construction, all reinforced concrete, so it was fireproof, and as much as they could make it escape-proof. One-man cells. If you go back a couple of minutes to think about the picture I showed you of the wooden cell house, here, all concrete construction, one-man cells. Cells were 5 feet by 9 feet rather than 6 by 3. Each one had electricity, heat, running water, and a flush toilet. The soldiers, even today at San Quentin Penitentiary, 2 men share a cell smaller than these. This picture was taken 108 years ago, and it shows how military ran a prison in those days. The guy without a hat is a prisoner, lounging. The fellow next to his back turned, that's a guard. And the fellow on the ground floor actually got a swagger stick under his arm. That's probably the captain of the guards. The recreation yard, again, those ubiquitous P's that are written on the back of everybody's uniform. Through the 1920s and the 1930s, Alcatraz remained a military prison, but they made a semantic change. And rather than calling it a military prison in 1915, they called it a disciplinary barracks. Main difference was that the guys who were being sent there still had a chance, after undergoing discipline, of going back to being soldiers in the Army. And about 75% of the guys who were sent to Alcatraz after they finished their sentence, rather than being kicked out of the Army, dishonorable discharge, they were able to go back to their original units. And the island had a pretty good reputation for rehabilitation. They began to offer skills like sewing and wood finishing, remedial classroom training. But it was an incredibly expensive island to run because it's an island, because there's no utilities from the mainland. They had to have their own powerhouse. Water had to be brought out. There's no water on Alcatraz. And as the Great Depression hit and more on in the 1930s, the Army decided, let's close Alcatraz. It's not doing us any good. And the Army's small enough in these post-war years, we could focus it all at Leavenworth, Kansas, and Fort Jay in New York. So they announced Alcatraz was going to close. The city Visitors and Convention Bureau was just ecstatic because Alcatraz had always been a black eye to the people of San Francisco. Everybody arrived by ship in those days. And as they came in through the Golden Gate for crossing the Pacific, the first thing they saw was a giant prison in the middle of the bay where the United States locked up its own soldiers. Hey, to have it closed, people are thinking, wow, what else could happen with Alcatraz? There was even an idea of maybe making it into an immigration station. That never happened. But what did happen was at the same time that the Army was looking at shutting down Alcatraz as a cost-saving feature, the civilian branch of that's called the Bureau of Prisons that ran America's civilian penitentiaries, they were being overflowed with people that had been locked up in the 1920s and 30s for things like prohibition violations and organized crime and what they called mobile gangsters, the Ma Barker, Bonnie and Clyde gang types. When these people were locked up for breaking federal law, they were put into existing federal penitentiaries at Leavenworth, Kansas, and McNeil Island, Washington, Atlanta, Georgia. There was an overcrowding going on. These people, once they were inside prison, they kept causing problems. And what the Bureau of Prisons decided was they needed a new prison, one where you could take what were called the irredeemable types, the worst of the worst, the people that continual escapees and mob people, put them in one prison, throw the hardest discipline at them you can, and that'll lighten the problems of other penitentiaries, and it'll make it more manageable. Supposedly, that J. Edgar Hoover said, you take all the rotten apples, you put them in one barrel, and you nail the lid on, and that was Alcatraz. The Army transferred Alcatraz to the Bureau of Prisons in late 1933, and a whole new crew came out to run Alcatraz. These were the civilian correctional officers, or the guard staff, handpicked from existing penitentiary staff around the country. This in the dead center in this picture, seated is Warden Johnston, the first warden of Alcatraz, who had actually been something of a reformer in the prison movement. He'd been a warden at San Quentin. He'd been up at Folsom. He'd been retired, but he was asked to come back to run the new prison on Alcatraz. And he almost undid all of the work he had done as a reformer. He made Alcatraz the toughest institution there was. First off, the people that they were going to have sent there, they were the worst of the worst. You weren't sentenced to Alcatraz by the courts. The way that the system worked was you were already doing time in another federal penitentiary, and the institution's management, the administration, the warden, the guard staff, they felt that you were enough of a problem, they would single you out to be transferred to Alcatraz Island. And the island was actually going to be a very exclusive penitentiary. It would be much smaller than it was when the Army ran it. The Army had cells for 600 people in that big building. Alcatraz, as a federal civilian penitentiary, never exceeded 302 people. The way that they got there, well, the first 32 men who were sent to Alcatraz never left the island. They were U.S. Army soldiers who were left behind. I went down to the National Archives in San Bruno, where they have the personnel records of these first 32 men. I wanted to know more about them. and I made the mistake of reading what some of their crimes were. Less said, the better, but they were all in for things that you wouldn't want loose on regular society. They said the dregs of the army, these were the dregs of the dregs. Security was goosed up on Alcatraz to the height of the technology of the 1930s. 5 guard towers were built around the island that were constantly maintained, searchlights, metal detectors, barbed wire. People who had lived on the island during the army days had never seen barbed wire before. They'd also never seen men in chains. That was all going to change when Alcatraz Penitentiary opened. But probably the biggest thing that they relied on most for security was the guard staff. This was a Phil Bergen. He was the captain of the guard in the 1940s and early 1950s. I met him when he was about 90 years old, and he scared me when he was 90. He must have absolutely been terrifying when he was in his prime. In his 30s, he was big, he was bulked, he could probably take out most convicts with bare hands, but he also had the ability of what used to be called verbal judo. He could talk down a situation. He was the kind of guy that they said he had a maniacal prisoner tearing up his cell, and they'd say, call Bergen. Bergen would walk up, just fill the door to the cell, and 9 times out of 10, the guy would just quiet down, go off to solitary. The first outside prisoners that were brought to the island came down by train, and on occasion there would be so many people arriving, coming on these trains like this one that arrived on August 22nd, 1934. Because of the fear of a massive prison break, the prison train would be put on a barge. In this case, the train coming from Atlanta Penitentiary, it was taken to Tiburon. They unhooked the locomotive, and the 2 front train cars with the bars on the windows, those were 55 prisoners were locked up. They had been chained to their benches inside those trains on a 4-day train trip in August. So it must have just been fetid inside there. But they got them to the island, and the Warden Johnson sent a report to Washington, D.C. 53 crates of furniture arrived in good order. That was code for the 53 men. When they got into their prison, this was going to be their world. 5x9 cell, bunk, toilet, sink, a couple of books to read, your clothing hanging on hooks on the wall. And you had a rule book, and the rule book spelled out in very simple language what your different rights and privileges were. And it said, rule number 5, you were entitled to food, clothing, shelter, and medical attention. Everything else is a privilege. The privileges are earned by good behavior. So this was your world 23 hours a day. You were allowed out for 3 20-minute meals and then back to your cell. On Alcatraz, good behavior meant you got privileges, small ones. We'll talk about some in a second. But the idea was to change your behavior. If you were going to be on Alcatraz, you were going to go along with the rules, and you could be there as long as you wanted to be a hardhead. If you wanted to obey the rules, go along with the system, you could earn your way out. Most guys were only on Alcatraz for about 5 years. If you decide not to go along with the program, there was a lower level. There were rooms that were called the dungeons, parts of the old pre-Civil War fortress on Alcatraz that had been converted to underground solitary confinement. These were used usually for the most violent of the prisoners, and also for strike breaking. You get the strike leader. Official rules down here were 19 days at a stretch in the dark, bread and water diet. After 19 days, you were taken out. If your behavior hadn't changed, after a day in the hospital, you came back for another 19 days. Very few men wanted to see it a second time. Privileges started with allowing you to go to the yard. If you just wanted to stay in your cell and only be let out for meals, that was where you began, as a fish. Early privileges were being allowed out into the yard, surrounded by 17-foot walls. This was the outside world for a lot of convicts on Alcatraz. I talked to one guy who said that he spent 7 years on Alcatraz without ever walking on dirt, only walking on concrete surfaces, or maybe the little bit of sand and the baseball diamond that was there. Again, they were holding out as privileges good behavior. And one of the things that you could do There were church services. If you behaved yourself, they had Catholic services and Protestant services every Sunday, and they had a Jewish rabbi who'd come by as requested. The chapel, the altar boy was a convict, privilege. The chapel was converted into a movie theater, and men on good status, twice a month they'd have movies. Yeah, generally, cheapo westerns or maybe war movies, musicals. Nothing, of course, having to do with crime. No Jimmy Cagney movies or anything like that. Other privileges, work in the factories. This wasn't rehabilitation work. This was just, in this case, they're making gloves. They made army uniforms. They refinished furniture. They had a shoe shop. It got you out of your cell, and you got to earn a little bit of money. They didn't give you any cash, of course, but you could build up a bank account so that there'd be something for you when you eventually got out of prison. Apparently, the biggest privilege on the island was this: gardening. They would select convicts who showed an interest in gardening, who were not convicted of violent crimes, and they would allow them to do gardening work around the island. It started out as sort of just an effort to get a hand on all the gardens that the army people had planted and left behind. So the warden's secretary, he got permission from the warden to start recruiting likely candidates, and they would, and they turned large areas of the island into beautifully maintained gardens. You were outside, you were working in the fresh air, you were working in the dirt. This was a highly sought after job. But what made Alcatraz most notorious wasn't the gardens, it wasn't the day-to-day operations, it was the famous convicts that were sent to Alcatraz. And I said it before, to repeat, they wanted Alcatraz to be a visible example of the U.S. Army and how it handled the world's toughest prisoners, its most famous prisoners. They didn't do this in a vacuum. They didn't do this secretly. There were press tours of the island before it opened. There's old movie tone newsreels referring to Uncle Sam's Bastille in the Bay, waiting for the crime bosses. Now, this is one of them, George Kelly Barnes, Machine Gun Kelly. He and his wife, Catherine, they were bank robbers, they kidnappers, they were caught. They were both sentenced to life in prison. He did use a machine gun one time, didn't shoot it, but he did use a machine gun one time in a bank robbery. He was an odd bird. He was highly educated, college grad. He was well-read, extremely well-mannered. When visitors came to Alcatraz, sometimes VIPs would come and they'd be introduced, some of the convicts. When they met Kelly, one guy said he seemed more like a bank president than a bank robber. The convicts, they teasingly called him Pop Gun Kelly because he had never apparently fired a weapon, but he was doing life. He was on Alcatraz from 1934 to 1951. He transferred to Leavenworth, Kansas. He died without ever leaving Leavenworth. This is the guy that caused us some of the biggest problems as rangers on Alcatraz, Robert Stroud, the Birdman of Alcatraz, because everybody had seen the Birdman of Alcatraz. And the Birdman of Alcatraz did a marvelous job of mythologizing an extremely violent and psychotic man who did have the ability to raise, breed, research, treat birds. He wrote a book called Stroud's Digest of Bird Diseases. And when he was at Leavenworth, Kansas, at one time, he had 300 birds in cages inside his cell. In fact, he had 2 cells that he was allowed to use. And he was very popular in the media because, here's this poor guy who's raising birds. Isn't this a shame? And well, he was in for manslaughter originally. He was a pimp and he killed a guy in a fight over a woman in Alaska. And when he was at Leavenworth, Kansas, he stabbed a guard to death in the mess hall in front of about 1,000 witnesses. He'd been sentenced to death and it was commuted to life. And the prison decided they were going to keep him life in solitary confinement. He became so famous that the Bureau of Prisons decided that he's going to Alcatraz. It was a great place to isolate someone. Also, too, no pets allowed on Alcatraz. He was sent to the island and he was there from 1942 to 1959. He was transferred out of the island and he died in the Springfield Medical Facility in 1963. a couple of days before JFK was assassinated. Bumpy Johnson, he pretty much headed up the African Americans on Alcatraz. Alcatraz was de facto segregated. The African American convicts and the white convicts liked it that way. They had their own territory. They had respect for each other. Wanted something done with the so-called colored inmates. Bumpy was the man he went to. He was called the King of Harlem, or the Al Capone of Harlem. He ran numbers, ran prostitution. A couple of movies have been made about him. One of the better known one was The Cotton Club. And Bumpy Johnson was one of the guys who went through Alcatraz twice. Remember, the idea was you were supposed to learn your lesson and conform when you got out of Alcatraz. Well, a lot of guys like Bumpy came through 2 times. One guy came through 3 times, just didn't get it. Bumpy himself, he was in and out of Alcatraz. In this picture here, this is his booking photo in 1959. Al Capone was probably the poster boy for Alcatraz. He's the one we get the most questions about. Where was his cell? Did he ever try to escape? Capone had a big name, but he had no power on Alcatraz. He wasn't involved with any gangs. All the money that he had back in Chicago couldn't buy him anything on the island. In fact, he tried to offer to buy band instruments. Yeah, we'll set up an Alcatraz band. And he went to the warden with an offer saying, I'll pay for them all. And the warden just turned him down. They kept him as powerless as they could. And in an odd way, it helped break Capone because he was a big man, he was a big target, but he had no power. And as a result, he was constantly getting in fights. Young punks thought, geez, if I can, get a piece of Al Capone, I'll make my name. He was stabbed once. And he was mentally deteriorating. He was transferred off the island in January 1939, about 4.5 years after arriving, because he was just untreated syphilis. It had started to affect his brain, and he had probably onset dementia. Picture taken of him just before he was transferred to Terminal Island in Los Angeles. He got out of prison in 1940, and he died in 1947 at home. He had a palatial estate in Florida, and he apparently was pretty much totally out of it the last few years of his life. People from Chicago who came and saw him just shook their head and said, poor Al, he's gone. And when he died, amazingly, with everything that he had done in his career, he was only 48 years old. You can't really talk too much about Alcatraz without talking about how it changed over the years. There were some rules that were just abhorrent when the island first opened. Maybe one of the worst was there was a rule of silence. Originally, Warden Johnson wouldn't allow prisoners to talk except in the recreation yard and maybe in the shops to something like hand me a hammer. Otherwise, in the dining hall, when moving from place to place yourselves, you could not talk. That rule was pretty much just ignored by the convicts one day starting around 1938 or 39. Everybody just started talking. You couldn't put the whole population into solitary at once, so that they let it slide. Eventually, extension courses from UC Berkeley were allowed. Prisoners could buy art supplies and do like paint by numbers artwork in their cells. When World War II hit, the prisoners, and it's sort of an odd thing about a lot of prisoners, they're incredibly patriotic. And when the war hit, they couldn't enlist, of course. What they did is they threw themselves into war work. This is a bank robber escaper who's using his skills as a welder. He's repairing buoys for the U.S. Navy that held up nets in San Francisco Bay. Charlie Berta, he was considered the most dangerous convict on Alcatraz by the guards. But boy, when he found that he could do this to do his bit for the Army, he did. Other convicts were making nets for Navy ships. They were making uniforms for the Army and the Navy. There was a laundry on Alcatraz doing just tons and tons of laundry that came over from the various military bases around the bay. Now, this appears to be a U.S. Army tech sergeant. It's not. It's Alcatraz convict John Giles, registry number 250. Giles used his opportunity. He was working on the dock as a stevedore. Every once in a while, he'd steal a piece of Army uniform. And He did it over a period of months, and he stowed all the pieces of uniform in a duffel bag hanging under the pier. One day, when a U.S. Army launch approached Alcatraz, he ducked under the pier, put on the very rumpled uniform, climbed out, stepped on the Army boat, and merrily went off to Angel Island, which was the next stop. He thought the boat was going to go to San Francisco. It didn't. It went to Angel Island. The guard staff telephoned ahead to the officer of the day on the military base on Angel Island, headed over there with a speedboat, and as Giles got off the boat, he was in his 50s, kind of stood out among all the 20-something soldiers. They walked up to him, clapped the irons on, and supposedly he said, "Damn, I thought this tub was going to Frisco." He was back on Alcatraz in about half an hour, and he had a couple of years added to his sentence for that little escape trick. Escapes, Alcatraz was reputedly escape-proof. They're still calculating how many people successfully escaped in the Army era. Remember, it had 90 years as an Army prison, and lots of men escaped. But because records are so scant, we can only estimate that several dozen prisoners successfully escaped Fort Alcatraz. Once it became a federal penitentiary, though, the numbers are solid. 36 men tried to escape in 14 different attempts. 23 were caught, brought back to the island. 6 were killed trying to escape. If you were seen going over a fence or in the water, guards had orders, shoot to stop. Now, they're not going to go out and try to coax you back. You're shot. 2 drowned. 2 were executed at San Quentin for their role. And 5 men missed. Is that me? Okay. Glitches of the internet. If you look at this picture of the island, at the extreme right end, there's a cluster of like white apartment houses down there. This was the family compound. Somewhere in the vicinity of 250 to 300 civilians at any one time lived on Alcatraz. This was the guard staff. This was the wives of the guards, the lighthouse keepers, and the children. At any given time, there were about 75 school-age kids living on Alcatraz. They were restricted to the very south end of the island. You see a fence in the background here, the kids' playground. That was the wire. All the families lived on the parade ground behind the wire. They were not allowed out through that fence until the very end of the day when every convict was locked in his cell and counted. Then they could go out, walk around the island, stretch their legs. There was a rec hall. You talk to the people who lived on the island in those days, they said it was great. You never locked your doors. There was a recreation hall. They had movies. There was a store. The kids could go down to the beach. They could fish. Gardens. One of my good friends who grew up on Alcatraz, she said, when she went to school, everybody said, "Aren't you afraid?" And her response was very pat, and it was very accurate. She said, "Why would you be afraid? Everybody's dad's a cop, and you know where all the bad guys are locked up." These people who lived on Alcatraz formed a very tight-knit community, and they still get together even today. They call themselves the Alcatraz Alumni Association. The youngest of them are probably about my age, but in the 1960s, they were sort of an exclusive group, the Alcatraz kids. Took a boat to school in the city all the time, and in fact, you lived by a boat schedule. One of the worst fates that could happen to you was to be on a date in San Francisco in the evening and miss the last boat back to Alcatraz. You never lived it down. Rumors of closing Alcatraz started in the 1940s. Too expensive to run. It's too isolated. They're going to get rid of this place. Guards, when they arrived in the 50s and early 60s, were said, "Don't bother to unpack. They're going to close this place any day." It tended to lead to sort of a anyway feel among the staff that, we're just kind of keeping time here, and nothing's ever happened. It hasn't been an escape attempt in years. Well, these 3 guys blew that out of the water. On June 11th, 1962, Frank Morris, Clarence Anglin, his brother John Anglin, did what was considered impossible. They escaped not from Alcatraz, but from inside the cell house and from inside their cells. Evidence photo shows a very forlorn guard on the morning of June 12th looking at a very large hole carved in the back wall of the cell of one of the two Anglin brothers. What the three men realized was that security was getting lax, and the building was getting old, and the concrete could actually be chipped away at with a chipping tool. Each man carved a big hole in the back of his cells and created a paper mache wall painted the same color as the cell walls so they could crawl out through the hole. You can see there's a crawl space back there. That crawl space led to the roof. You go out, pull out the fake section of wall behind, and no one knows you're missing, unless they look for you in your cell and you're not there. Well, this is how you solve that problem. Look at the bed. Each guy made a paper mache head of himself that he would tuck into his bed whenever he crawled out that hole in the back of the cell to make it look like he was simply asleep in the bed. And the guards for several months went by and they counted these three guys as president accounted for when they were actually out there sawing away at bars on a ventilator to make their way out of the prison onto the prison roof. The four heads that were made, I should be specific, 3 men escaped. The fourth guy was in on it but chickened out at the last minute. These heads, incredibly fragile, are some of the most valuable items that we have in the museum collection of the Alcatraz archaeology and artifact collection over at the Presidio. Other artifacts from the escape. This is a chipping tool made from a spoon handle bent electrical tape. The handle took them months to do, but they chipped away at the walls. How'd they get the vent out? This is a drill made out of a stolen motor from a vacuum cleaner used to drill the bolt heads off. When they were discovered missing, the biggest manhunt in San Francisco history began. But these guys had a 9-hour head start. They got out of their cells sometime around 10 o'clock at night. They weren't noticed they were missing until 7 o'clock the next morning. They're still out there, if they are still out there. Let me put it this way. If they are still out there, they're still wanted by the FBI. In fact, notice the evidence tags. These items that are now in the Park Service collection are actually on long-term loan from the FBI. If these guys show up again, the FBI want them because there is no term limit on escaping from a federal penitentiary. In fact, they have had artists age some of the historic photographs of how they would theoretically look today. There are periodically news stories and documentaries that these guys are alive and living down in South America somewhere. Personally, I don't believe it for the very simple reason that the odds were so much against them that they would ever make it to the mainland, let alone if they did. I mean, if someone made a movie about you starring Clint Eastwood and there were a dozen documentaries on television about you and the escape, wouldn't you come forward, sell your story? I mean, if you're in South America, there's no extradition, talk to Oprah. Okay. But that was the start of the end. March 21st, 1963, 10 months later, Alcatraz shuts down. There had been talk of closing Alcatraz before Morris and Anglin escaped. It pretty much sealed the deal. Alcatraz was literally falling apart. They did an estimate that it would take $5 million to bring the place up to speed. In 1963, that translates to something like $50 million in today's money, and that's just to repair the old damage. It didn't include things that were now mandatory in the 60s, like water sewage treatment, right? All the sewage was going right into the bay. So it was just a no-brainer. Close Alcatraz. In one hearing, somebody admitted that it would have been cheaper to have kept these guys in the Mark Hopkins than on Alcatraz, the amount that it cost just to run the island. It wasn't their incarceration, it was running an island. Power plants, waters, food, maintenance, utilities. The last men were marched off the island. The perp walk is what this is called, surrounded by media cameras. The paparazzi were out in force. They were invited. They documented it. Very last guy to get off the island. He was a young guy. He was a bank robber named Frankie Weatherman. It's from Alaska. He was prisoner number 1,576, the last number that had been issued. As he's getting on the boat, one of the reporters said, any last words, Frankie? And he looked and he said, yeah, it's good this joint is closing. Alcatraz was never no good for nobody, which is just absolutely horrible grammar, but it's a great statement. Prisoners, they went to the other federal penitentiaries. A lot of them went to a penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, which was dubbed immediately the new Alcatraz, much of the dismay of the Bureau of Prisons. They said, Alcatraz is old, Alcatraz is gone, but the name persisted. And San Francisco was left with a quandary. What are we going to do with a vacant prison in the middle of San Francisco Bay? It was still owned by the U.S. government, by the Department of Justice. And over the years, it was offered to various government entities, none of whom wanted it because of the cost of running the island. They began looking around for maybe private sector ideas. And in 1969, this one was floated, and this one had the overjoyed support of Mayor Joe Alioto. It was funded by H. Lamar Hunt and big oil money out of Texas. And his idea was to take the island and convert it partly into a convention center and museum and partly into a museum celebrating aerospace and the discovery. Remember, we haven't even walked on the moon yet, but here's a giant stainless steel monument with an Apollo capsule on top of it. And people in San Francisco were horrified by this. People in San Francisco, when they were asked, what do you want to see done with Alcatraz? You know, the Chronicle ran contests. Most people said, tear the buildings down, give it back to the birds, let nature reclaim it. Almost no one wanted to see something like this happen. And then slightly before Thanksgiving, 1969, everything became moot because a group of Native American activists, mostly students from UC Berkeley and San Francisco State, decided that Alcatraz, it was just sitting there waiting for someone to do something with it. And they found an old treaty with the Sioux Nation from the 1860s that said that male members of the tribe could homestead empty government property. And they said, Alcatraz looks empty to us. So several hundred of them arrived in November 1969, and they stayed for 19 months. They called themselves the Indians of all tribes because they were Plains Indians and Mohawks and from the Southwest and some California Indians. And they banded together to try to make a stay on Alcatraz. Frankly, I was in college at this time. I did my activist bit. This was called street theater. What can you do that'll get people riled up and will get you a lot of media attention? Well, this did it. Media from all over the world descended on Alcatraz to see what the Indians were doing. The local activist communities, they just opened their purses and they opened their pantries and they donated food and clothing and money. Creedence Clearwater Revival, they donated a boat to shuttle people back and forth. And the government was set up with sort of a quandary. What are we going to do? We've got, at one point, there's like 400 occupiers. They were living in the old apartment houses. They were living in cells in the cell house. They took over the warden's house. What are we going to do? And the word came from someone at the White House, fall back. You know, do not force a confrontation. Probably after the riots in Chicago that had happened in 1968 and Black Power and everything else that was happening, the government felt the last thing I want to do is force a confrontation with Native Americans over an abandoned prison. You know, so let it play itself out, and they did. Life magazine covered what they called the Unthanksgiving that year when all the tribes came together and full tribal regalia to celebrate the taking of the island. And they ran in very shortly into the problem that everybody has, is the island is a rock. The support from the community started to peter out. A lot of these were students. They wanted to go back to school. They couldn't live on an island forever. The infrastructure was barely there. What was there collapsed shortly after. And they petered away. Went from several hundred to about a dozen, maybe 20 occupiers in 1971 when Coast Guard showed up. One morning, they rounded up the people still living on the island, took them to the mainland and released them. Weren't even given tickets. It just, that was how it ended. Government caretakers came and they took over the island, and they fenced it off to make sure that no one else would try to take it over. But something else was in the works. This is now 1971, 72, and there is a movement to create a vast national park to be called the Golden Gate National Recreation Area around San Francisco, to include former Army bases like Forts Baker, Barry, Cronkite, and Presidio, to include Fort Mason, to include state park land like Angel Island, and hey, how about Alcatraz? And Alcatraz was included within the future GGNRA, not because of its history as a penitentiary, but because of its history, don't laugh, as a lighthouse and as a military fort. That was what they thought were the most important parts of the history of Alcatraz Island. And it was open to the public in October 1973, basically to get people to get a look at the island that had been closed since forever. You know, no one had been officially allowed out there. The occupiers, they certainly weren't inviting the general public when they were there. So this was the first time when you could buy a ticket, go to Alcatraz. The first year the island was open, about 50,000 people came, and the park was just astounded at the response. We thought people get it out of their system, you know. Hey, you know, Alcatraz, now we can see it. Oh, is that all there is? Well, no, that isn't all there was. There was so much to the history of the island. It was so popular that the numbers just swelled. Last year, 1.7 million people visited Alcatraz. It's the #1 paid attraction in San Francisco. Oh, sure, yeah, the Golden Gate Bridge draws more people and Pier 39, but if you have to pay to actually go to it, it's Alcatraz. A couple of years back, TripAdvisor.com, they held a poll, and Alcatraz was voted the #1 tourist attraction in the United States. The sticking power, the infamy of Alcatraz, it just keeps going. What do people do when they go to Alcatraz? They want to go, they want to see the prison. Like I said, where's Al Capone's cell? So everyone pretty much makes a beeline up to the prison building, the big cell house atop the island. And the audio tour, that was one of the projects that I got to work on. In the 80s, we went out and we did exhaustive oral history interviews with convicts and guards who had worked on the island. And then out of 45 hours of oral history tapes, it was edited down to a 35, 40-minute tour. But the voices you hear, it's not actors, it's the people who were there. And now, frankly, most of them have passed on. But it's one of the most powerful audio tour experiences in the country because you're hearing it from the people who lived it, where they lived it. I like to say once people have Al Capone out of their system, they look around and say, what else is here on the island? They join ranger programs. The ranger guided programs talk about everything from famous inmates to different escape attempts to specially guided walks into closed areas of the island where you have to be escorted. If you're there during the spring and summer months, you get to watch cute little baby seagulls get born and turned into big, nasty French fry stealing seagulls. It's the biggest Western gull colony, or the second largest Western gull colony on the West Coast. And volunteers are clawing back the gardens of Alcatraz. They were overgrown, they were abandoned, they weren't tended from the time the families left the island in 1963. But enough was left that they were dedicated garden volunteers were able to recreate the gardens based on family slides, like I showed earlier, based on trace remains. And that's one of the most popular behind the scenes stories, is the gardens of Alcatraz. One of the reasons the prison has lasted is because it was built of pretty stern stuff, but wear and tear takes its place. This, if you go out there and you take your groups out there, always kind of see restoration going on. In this case, this is the oldest building on the island. It's the old prison library from the lower prison, built in the 1860s. It was in harm's way to the point where there was actually some fear it could collapse and land on the road. So several millions of dollars went into stabilizing it and repainting it. And when you're done, you barely notice anything's been done. And that's good restoration. Right? It'll weather soon enough. Right now, it's still bright paint. Frequently, people go around to the island or boats go around and they'll see shrink-wrapped buildings like this. Well, it's encapsulated because they're sandblasting old lead-based paint, or they're stripping asbestos and restoring these buildings to their original appearance. And this is how the water tower looked when we took the wrapping off. We even kept the graffiti from the Indian occupation, because the Indian occupation is part of the important history of Alcatraz. The further we get away from it, the more we realize it was a turning point in history. And who helps us repaint the graffiti? The occupiers. They themselves come back now too. Just as the Alcatraz alumni have a special place for Alcatraz in their hearts, so do the people who lived on the island and their children in the late 60s and in the early 70s. A lot of the history of Alcatraz comes from this, Hollywood. It's almost as soon as the island opened to the public, Hollywood decided we can sell tickets. And the first movie that came out was this one. It was called The Rock, Alcatraz Island. Ann Sheridan, John Littell. None of these early movies were filmed on the island. In fact, no movie would be filmed on the island at all during the time it was an operating penitentiary. So Hollywood built sound stages that looked something like Alcatraz. 7 miles from Alcatraz. Only the first couple of minutes is even laid on Alcatraz. It's about several escapees who float away on a raft and take over a lighthouse, and that's the next 90 minutes. But you get Alcatraz in the title, sells tickets. The house across the bay. This is the one that gave us Fitz, Birdman of Alcatraz. And sometimes it's just pure lunacy, pure fabrication. We have had several movies made on the island, a couple of Dirty Harry movies. This one, The Rock, Sean Connery, Nicolas Cage. Most people recognize its fantasy. I sure hope they do. And this is the one that is probably the biggest landmark. This may be one reason that Alcatraz remains as popular as it does. This was a major production. I was out there when they were shooting Escape from Alcatraz. It went on for months, and they essentially restored the penitentiary to the way it looked when it was operating. It was actually chilling to go inside the prison when it was full of about 100 extras, dressed up as correctional officers, as convicts, going through the daily routine. Some of the best interpretation I ever saw. No CGI in those days. In fact, if you go onto the International Movie Database, I did the other day, enter Alcatraz, you'll get 96 hits for 96 different movies, TV documentaries, TV series that have been produced. Sometimes the movie doesn't have the faintest linkage to Alcatraz. There was one that was laid in a prison in the Arctic, a fanciful prison, and it was called Frozen Alcatraz. You use the name, you get the tickets. And some of the mythology of Alcatraz, though, actually is true, because beneath a lot of the buildings on the island, there is a lower level to Alcatraz, areas the public seldom sees. Beneath, Alcatraz is so small as an area, it's only 22 acres. Buildings tended to be built on top of previous buildings, almost like you'd find in ancient Greece or Rome, but here it's all compacted from the 1850s to now. One tunnel actually goes clear through the island. It's short, it's only about 120 feet, and it was dug in the 1870s, essentially as a shortcut across the island. I speculate they simply had an overabundance of convicts and needed to have them do something, and they decided to create a shortcut as a make-work project, and it also shaved 1.5 minutes out of walking around the island. Beneath the prison building itself, there's a welter of rooms that are part of that old towering building that was called the Citadel. These were living quarters for the guard, or rather for the Army soldiers and their families. There were kitchens on this level. There were a couple of jail cells. And scratched into the walls of these rooms, many more of them were converted to underground dungeons. You can still find graffiti from men who were there, like up in the upper left, September 8, 1934. If you read closely, it says day. Guy that spent 17 days down there in solitary confinement. Upper right, Bill Wright, Tex, Chuck Cole, and a lot of numbers like the bottom. 10604. We have no idea who this was. That's a U.S. Army soldier number. All the Army records were destroyed. So their graffiti lingers, but we can't give names to these numbers anymore. Part of the enduring history and the intrigue of Alcatraz. When we do demolition, sometimes we realize how close we are to history. They had to remove the floor from one of the prison cells one time, and they found underneath just a 3-inch slab of concrete flooring, there's the brickwork from the prison right underfoot. That's why we're using now modern techniques like ground penetrating radar to try to track foundation remains, buildings that survive underneath other buildings. Here, the wreck yard, they're surveying tunnels that were dug during the 1870s when the island was being modernized as a fort. We found a welded shut manhole cover, didn't know what was down there. The archaeologists decided to unweld the manhole, and they found drained water cistern. This was one of my discoveries, not mine personally, but one that I was involved with. We found a bricked up doorway in the powerhouse complex, got permission to unbrick the doorway, went down, and this is an underground pool of oil, storage oil for the boilers. The scale of the room, it's about the inside as the nave of a small church. It looks like really something out of like Phantom of the Opera and the labyrinth beneath the Parisian Opera House. Alcatraz to me is incredibly fascinating because we're still discovering, we're still finding, we're still learning about Alcatraz. And I was fortunate enough to actually meet many of the people who live the island's history. They shared with me their time on the island. Whenever we could, we recorded them. And if you haven't been to Alcatraz for a while, go. Obviously, no one's going to Alcatraz at this time in history. We've all been under seclusion now for 7 weeks. This will end. And when it does, go to Alcatraz, bring your friends, bring your clients. And after you've seen the cell house, say to any of the ranger staff, hey, are there any tours of the Citadel today? Secret stuff. That's my old employer. Thank you guys for coming. And I'll be happy to be here as long as you want, answer questions. Hey, I got muted somehow. 2 of the pictures that I showed were taken by Edward Muybridge. The one of the soldiers all clamoring around the big giant cannon, and the one of the families in their garden. Those were Muybridge. The other 2 pictures were taken, the first ones I showed of the big lines of cannon, it was taken by another San Francisco photography firm. Those pictures were all supposed to have been destroyed. Those were taken without permission, and they should have been destroyed as national security breaches, and instead they turned up misfiled in the archives of the city of Sacramento.
Oh, wow. Hey, I'm going to see if I can do it this way. Somehow you disappeared on my screen, and I am not sure how that you're here. Okay, so I don't know if other people can see it, but I'm just going to take, hey, Ed Franklin, if you're there, I've unmuted you if you want to ask your question.
Oh, sure. Hey, John, how you doing?
Hi.
Hold on, let me see here. All right, hold on here. Very good. So, John, my quick question for you is, I heard a story that Whitey Bulger, he of famous Boston mob boss fame, he worked undercover for the FBI, and was 2 different movies were made about him with Jack Nicholson and Johnny Depp. He was actually sentenced to Alcatraz and then revisited while he was on the lam from the FBI. Is that true?
Yep. He and his girlfriend visited Alcatraz at least once, had pictures taken of themselves, posing inside a cell like every other tourist. Yeah, the guy had chutzpah, I'll tell you that.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Jason Keller. Wait, let me unmute you, Jason. Jason, are you there, Jason?
Maybe he left.
So Jason's question, if he's not here, is said a ferry deckhand told me there's a hole next to the island that's so deep the Navy tested submarines down there. Any truth?
I don't think so. We've got a lot of subsurface mapping of the bay bottom around Alcatraz, and the bay. Alcatraz is a drowned mountain, okay, a hilltop, and it's been so eroded over the years that if you were to drain the water out of the bay, you'd find sort of a flattish, barren area, and then Alcatraz rises almost like a column out of the bottom of the bay. There's one area where there's like a mountain of silt built up because that's where dredges used to dump all the tailings that they were taking out of San Francisco Bay to keep the channel open. But aside from that, no, there's no holes that I've ever heard of.
Wow. All right. I just wanted to say for those people that are still on, I have posted in the chat. We're getting a lot of chat, John. Great photos. People are from New York here saying they feel like they traveled today. Awesome photos, and really glad they're a part of it. I also wanted to say the people that are still on, if you've really appreciated this, I put John's email in the chat. It's johnamartini@comcast.net. If you have enjoyed our tour here today and you'd like to offer him a gratuity after having this presentation, please feel free to use that address to get into his PayPal account. You can also find him at johnmartini.com, and he said he's available for questions if you want to email him too and see what's up. So Jason Cohen said, what happened to the Hopi prisoners and how long were they held there?
They were on the island from January till I believe it was September of 1895, and then they were returned back to their tribe. They kind of made an example of them. I don't think some of them finally just said, okay, fine, we'll send the kids to school. Others, I think, continued to resist, but none of them were ever returned to Alcatraz again.
Okay.
Yeah. Let me, hold on. I got my notes here. I want you to know I'm prepared. January to August, 1895.
There you go, Jason. He said can't get his mic going. So, hey, Ellen Delara, are you there? Ellen, I unmuted you if you want to ask your question. If not, I will totally ask it. And Ellen's question is, what was Al Capone's cell number, not his cell number? What is Al Capone's cell number? And hold on one sec. And can you talk about the part in the Triangle of Fire on the 4th of July reenactment, please?
Sure. I'd have to pull up other notes to get you his exact cell number, but I'll tell you where it was. If you are in the cell house, he had one of the outside cells facing the windows. There's not that many of them. He was on the second tier, second cell in, the windows facing Berkeley. And and it wasn't special treatment. You were assigned a cell when you arrived. It was just luck of the draw. Later on, he requested to be moved to another cell, and he was. Usually they'd move you around unless there was a reason for them not to. Okay, the 4th of July celebration, the Army, for the centennial of the country, the 4th of July, 1876, they decided that they didn't have the Blue Angels in those days, but as a show of military power, what they do is they'd let all the big harbor forts fire those huge cannon at an old derelict ship that they had filled with gunpowder and anchored out in the harbor, so that the first person that got a good solid hit on it, there'd be this spectacular explosion. And both the Navy and the Army were going to take turns shooting this ship. And they had something, they had hundreds of thousands of people on the hills watching this. It was called the Great Sham Battle. Nobody could hit it. The Navy was sailing by, firing broadsides. Everything was going haywire. They couldn't hit it. The Army forts, Fort Point, Alcatraz, Fort Mason, they fired their big guns. Cannonballs were flying wild all over the place. And but somebody managed to get close enough that they broke the anchor line. So you have this explosive-laden ship bobbing around San Francisco Bay, and they halted the fire, and a rowboat went out, and a guy climbed aboard to set fire to a fuse. And according to the newspaper, some woman in the hill said, "Look at that brave man." And somebody turned to her and said, "Lady, he's in the safest place in the harbor." The thing eventually, it kind of went up, kind of a There was no big explosion. If the people could have demanded their money back, they would have. But that was the story of the Great Sham Battle.
Wow, great question. I've never even heard of that. I'm going to take Lane off. Lane Clifford, if you want to ask, you have a question? You there?
You have to unmute. I can see Lane. I can see Lane talking, but I can't hear.
There you go. There you go. Hey, the statistics on the attempts to escape.
Yeah.
There was total number and then attempts and who may or may not have been successful. Could you just quote the numbers really quick?
Sure. Uh, 36 men in 14 different attempts.
Okay.
23 were caught. 6 were killed. 2 executed. And 5 are missing.
And the 3 guys from 1961.
63?
63.
Yeah.
So there was 2 others that are missing.
Yeah, there were 2 guys that in 1936 escaped from one of the shop buildings, but there was no real planning that went on with them, and they didn't have any head start. They simply took a monkey wrench, ripped the padlock off a gate, and dove off a cliff into the water. The guards could see them floundering around. By the time a boat got there, though, they were lost in the fog. So, yeah, it's the evidence is pretty good for all 5 of them that they're gone.
Yep. Yep. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Let's see. We got Susie Abbott, the fabulous Susie Abbott. I'm going to unmute her. Susie, are you here? She might not. She might be muted. But her question was, did the Native American... Oh, you got it?
Yeah, sorry. I just wanted to know, John, after the Indians, the whole Native American thing in the for those 18 months, did they get any demands met by the federal government?
Essentially, no. They were offered some pretty juicy alternatives, but they turned them down. You know where Lower Fort Mason Center is, the Center for the Arts and all the piers and off the grid where all that takes place?
Yeah, yes.
The occupiers were offered all of the pier area and warehouses at Lower Fort Mason if they'd leave Alcatraz, and they turned it down. When I first heard this, I said, "Oh, you're kidding! This has got to be lore." But I heard it from both the Native Americans and also from the representatives from Department of Interior, and they said it was on the table, it was discussed, and a quick explanation: there were 2 factions on the island of occupiers, one of whom were old-line political activists that said, we're doing this to get negotiating power. You know? And then there were the young altruists that said, no, we're going to turn this into Thunderbird University. We're here to stay. And when the offer was made to give him Lower Fort Mason, the old-line activists said, we've won. Look what, we're taking this, right? And the tribal council voted no. They said, no, we're going to turn it into Thunderbird University. So they kind of had a shot and lost it.
Wow. Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Let's see. We got hold on. We got a bunch of peeps. Jan, are you still in here? Jan, I'm gonna unmute Jan. And there she goes. Hey, Jan, do you want to ask your question?
Thank you very much, John. That was amazing. I really appreciate it. It feels like I got out of the house a little bit. I'm asking, my question is about, you mentioned that you knew someone who lived on Alcatraz. Was her last name Babbitt by any chance?
Babiak, Jolene Babiak.
Jolene Babiak, that's the one. She was great during the years that I was on duty at Alcatraz regularly. Up until the coronavirus, she was out there signing and selling books at least one day a week. Still doing that?
Will
She's
she
still
be back?
doing that.
Well, she was. She hopes to get back too. Her
Good.
dad is everybody else. Her father was associate warden, second in command, if you will, of Alcatraz, and they lived in a nice big house on the edge of the island. And the night that famous 1962 escape took place, where the guys disappeared and the dummy heads, the real warden was fishing. So her dad is the one that had to answer the phone and organize everything for the most infamous escape in American history. So,
Great. Thank you so much, John. I'm glad I asked that question.
okay, sure.
Let me see if there's I got a lot of great, everybody's like, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Wow.
And then Jason Cohen, it was about, no, that's a different one. Let's see. Let me see if I get any more. Clemencia, she's here. Oh, Clemencia, I'm gonna unmute you if you want to ask your question.
Okay.
Go for it.
Can you hear me?
Totally.
Okay. So I've heard it mentioned that even though the Native Americans didn't really get any of their demands met, that the occupation did publicize their plight, and eventually it did improve the way the government dealt with them, that the Bureau of Indian Affairs got better about it. Is that true?
Yes, the long-range fallout was that they did get incredible press and coverage and an awareness that there were still Native Americans. You know, a lot of people, thought, oh, just Indians in movies. No, there's still Native Americans, and a lot of them had been resettled by the government off of reservations and into urban areas, and promises had been made about monetary support that never came through. Well, this brought to light what the situation was, and there was a total rethinking of how the tribes are treated and how they're recognized, individual members. And now the occupation is seen as basically the turning point for the modern American Indian movement in the United States. When we were out there, the occupation had only been over for about a year and a half, and most of us who were incredibly sympathetic to the occupation, our view at the time was, well, that didn't work. We were too close to the event to see it.
Sure. Thank you.
Well, I think I'm just going to open up anybody that is still on the call. If you have a question that you'd like to ask John, I've unmuted, and if anybody have any other questions, I think unless there looks like everybody's great. Well, I think I just say from everyone that was on this, that just reading the chats, that this was just such a great presentation. Thank you so much. I saw so many pictures I've never seen before, and just seeing all those colorful pictures. Thank you very much for putting all the gardening ones in.
Ellen's going to be a volunteer gardener out there.
Yeah, so I can't wait. And John, I really can't tell you, this was such a success, and thank you so much for just being here and giving such an amazing presentation. I am going to be sending up a follow-up email to everyone for this, and with more of your information and website and everything like that. So do you have any questions for us, John? For me.
Like I said, I got a portfolio of PowerPoint programs about San Francisco history. So if people would like, say the word, I'd be happy to do more of these.
Great. Awesome. It was seriously stellar, the history that you gave us today, and those pictures, amazing. So I would just want to thank you. I think we'll just call this meeting, this presentation over. I hope you've enjoyed it, had a great time with not only your martini that you were drinking, but the fabulous John Martini, the rock star of the rock. And we look forward to seeing everybody at a Monday happy hour sometime soon. So thanks again, John. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody.
All right, guys.
Thank you, Helen, for hosting, and that was really nice of you to take care of that for us.
Ah, you got it. We got more coming.